Let's now pick up with chapter 20.3 on international finance. In this particular set of slides, we're going to talk about some practical problems that we find in the foreign exchange market. For one thing, as this is titled, there's a resistance to exchange rate changes emotionally. The emotional resistance. Most people don't like fluctuating exchange rates. Let's think about a practical example. Picture yourself as a foreign student in school and you have to come up with $10,000 to pay your tuition here in the US. Now, you're from a foreign country. The exchange rate is changing all the time. Last semester, you had to get, let's say, 15,000 euros traded in to get the $10,000 in order to go to school. This year, because the dollar appreciated, you now need to get 20,000 euros to buy $10,000 in order to go to school. You notice the school didn't change their tuition, it's still $10,000, but what about the cost to the foreign student if the dollar appreciates, which simultaneously means what happens to their domestic currency? It must be depreciating because those are reciprocals of each other, right? If the dollar appreciates, then the other currency must depreciate. Under those circumstances, you could see the student would not be very happy. It takes more and more and more money to buy the same thing in the United States, where the price itself has not changed in US dollars. Now, of course, on the flip side, what if the US dollar was depreciating? Then instead of taking 15,000 euros to buy the $10,000, you might only need to use 12,000 euros to buy the $10,000. So if the US dollar is depreciating, then every single semester, even when the tuition stays at 10,000, the euro price would continue to fall because you could buy more dollars for the same number of euros that you could the previous semester. My point, of course, is that people only complain about these things when the foreign exchange rate moves against them. In other words, when their own domestic currency is depreciating and the foreign currency they're trying to buy is appreciating, then it becomes a problem. So, as it turns out, many people would actually prefer if exchange rates didn't fluctuate. So let's assume that, let's go back to our original numbers, and I made the numbers up just so we'd have nice, easy, round numbers to work with. Let's assume that 15,000 euros can buy 10,000 US dollars. That means there'd be what? 1.5 euros equals $1 in that example. So that would be the exchange rate, 1.5 euros to the dollar. Under those circumstances, if the exchange rate was fixed each and every semester, all you would have to come up with is, if you were a European, would be 15,000 euros in order to get the $10,000 tuition paid for at school here in the United States. So under those conditions, you don't worry about what the exchange rate is going to be because the exchange rate is fixed and doesn't change. So that's what is popular. And so there is a mechanism to handle that if we choose to. We could go to something called fixed exchange rates. So fixed exchange rates, by their very definition, means that instead of having a floating exchange rate where the dollar and the euro can fluctuate in value against each other, the valuations are fixed. So whatever the ratio, they don't have to be fixed at the same dollar number. It's not $1 equals 1 euro to be fixed. It simply means that if it's $1 equals 1.5 euros today, it'll be $1 equals 1.5 euros next year and the year after that and the year after that as well. So as long as the ratio remains the same, we call it a fixed exchange rate. But as we're going to find out, there's problems with fixed exchange rate systems. There's a reason why we ended up going to flexible exchange rates. At one time, in fact, we did have fixed exchange rates between the United States and all the European countries. We all operated on a fixed exchange rate system. So, how do you do a fixed exchange rate system? Oftentimes you do it by setting each currency's value against what's called a common standard, such as the gold standard. Now, we, listening, both me speaking and you all listening, I'm in my 60s, I presume you all are much younger than that, but even during my lifetime, we've not been on the gold standard. The US went off the gold standard during the Great Depression back in the 1930s, so this has not been in existence for very close to 100 years. But at one time, the gold standard did exist, and it existed for multiple decades and included most of the major nations of the world. And what they would do is they would define their currency as a certain number of ounces of gold, and that currency could not change. So for instance, back before the Great Depression, the US dollar was defined as 20 US dollars equals 1 ounce of gold. And then of course the British would set their standard at 10 pounds equals 1 ounce of gold. So if they're both equal to 1 ounce of gold, then all of a sudden we just have $20 equals 10 pounds. That's a ratio of 2 to 1. And so 1 pound buys $2, or vice versa, 1 US dollar buys 1/2 of a pound. So that would be the exchange rate, $1 to half a pound in that particular example. Now, of course, I made those numbers up. Again, I just wanted to have nice, easy, round numbers that we could all do in our head and not make the numbers the crux of the problem. What we're trying to understand is, under a gold standard, as long as both currencies are defined as a certain amount of gold, then obviously they must be defined relative to each other, correct? And in the example I gave, it would be $1 equals half a British pound. Okay, so that's a fixed exchange rate system. And then the French franc, the German mark, the Italian lira, all these different currencies would be defined as a certain amount of gold, and therefore would be defined as a certain exchange rate to each other. Now, the problem with fixed exchange rates is the demand for and the supply of each currency continues to fluctuate because people are buying and selling different things in the open international markets, but the fixed exchange rates do not account for this. Let's try to explain that in the next slide. Let's take a look at this picture here. You notice that we have a supply and demand curve. Let's look at the dark blue supply curve. We're just going to assume that remains fixed at its current slope that you see on the page, on the graph. And then we have two different demand curves. The first one is the dotted one. The second one is the solid green line. Okay? Now, let's assume, just for argument's sake, that the original demand curve is D1, and so the demand for US dollars and the supply of US dollars is at the intersection of the supply and the demand curve. So exchange rate 1 and quantity supplied 1 is where the market's in balance. And let's assume so things are fine. The exchange rate is currently working. Now, let's take a look at what happens if the demand for instance, British pounds increases. Because this one here is a US dollar buys how many British pounds. Now, where would an increase in demand for British pounds come from? Let me just toss out a couple of examples. Again, I'm making all these things up just for illustrative purposes. Let's assume that the Land Rover company comes out with a really cool brand new Range Rover model, and Americans love it. And so Americans go to their local, dealership here in the US, the Range Rover dealership, and then they demand more Range Rovers than they normally do. So normally Range Rovers sell about 1,000 Range Rovers per week in the US. Now demand increases to 2,000 Range Rovers. Okay, well, how are Americans going to pay for this? We don't have British pounds in the US. The Range Rovers are made in England. We got to pay for them in British pounds. So how are we going to handle this? Well, obviously, the dealership has to go into the foreign exchange market with dollars in hand and sells their dollars and buys British pounds. So now let's take a look at what's going to happen. You notice, and I'm going to go highlight this for a second, you notice at the exchange rate that was already in existence at the new demand for British pounds from all these people trying to buy these Range Rovers is way over here. Okay, and that's what we show here. The quantity demanded is way up here. But unfortunately, what's the quantity supplied of dollars? It's still way back here, right? Okay, now we've got ourselves an imbalance. And as we can see on our slide, it's called an excess demand for pounds at the fixed exchange rate. Because remember, as we discussed in previous slides, not on this particular slide deck, but way back in 20.1 and 20.2, we mentioned that if you have floating exchange rates, you always end up in balance because then you move to this run right here. And why is that imbalance? Because at a much higher exchange rate, you scare away Americans from buying as many Range Rovers as they would have ordinarily liked to buy. Because you notice, if the exchange rate stays low, then what happens to the number of people who want to buy the Range Rover? That's way over here. But unfortunately, there's only this many British pounds available. Whereas if you have floating exchange rates, what ends up happening is the exchange rate rises to the new equilibrium, and that means the number of dollars it takes to buy a British pound requires more dollars. So what happens to the price of the British Range Rover in the US? Even though the British price remains exactly the same, by the time you pay the higher currency valuation, the British Range Rover in the US costs a lot more US dollars than it did before. And that discourages some people from wanting to buy it. Simultaneously, the higher value of the British pound compared to the US dollar now makes a vacation at Disney World for a Brit to be relatively cheap, because they can buy a lot more dollars with the same number of British pounds than they could before. So even though most of us think of going to Disney as expensive, it's over $100 a day for a ticket to get into the Disney World thing. If you're a Brit, well, now because the British pound is appreciating in value under flexible exchange rates, you can buy a lot of tickets for the same number of British pounds. So going on vacation becomes cheap. So Brits now supply more pounds to the market as British people try to go to Disney World, and therefore we now have a balance between supply and demand at the higher exchange rate. But what if you don't have flexible exchange rates and the exchange rate remains low? Then Brits find going to Disney World still very expensive, and not very many go to Disney World, so they're not supplying British pounds to the market. But there's lots of Americans who are trying to get a hold of British pounds because at the low exchange rate, buying a Range Rover is still relatively cheap, and they want to buy them. And now we have a mismatch, right? There's more Americans trying to buy British pound-based products than there are Brits who are trying to buy American dollar-based products. And that's what we're seeing here in the diagram. This distance here is going to be the excess demand of pounds at the fixed exchange rate. So as we see in our words, take a look back at our slide now. So more dollars are flowing out than are flowing in. So now we have a balance of payments deficit for the United States and a balance of payments surplus for Britain. And this is not being solved by the floating prices. Because remember, in most capitalist systems, that's almost the definition of capitalism, is that you permit prices to either rise or fall depending on supply and demand. We almost never have a surplus of excess demand or excess supply, no shortages, no surpluses, because the prices always either rise or fall until the market comes back into balance. But with a fixed exchange rate, there's no mechanism for the market to come back into balance. So now we have ourselves a problem. And this is one of the major criticisms of fixed exchange rates, even though people would actually like the price of currency to be fixed so that the fluctuating currencies don't change the price of things when you're trying to buy from a foreign market. Okay, so what are we going to do? We're talking about what are we going to do under a fixed exchange rate, of course, because we already know what the solution will be for flexible exchange rates. Just let the exchange rate rise until it provides enough British pounds to offset the number of dollars being supplied so that supply and demand are now back in balance. But if you're not going to do that, now what are you going to do? Well, like I said, we're not going to let the exchange rate fluctuate. So now the U.S. government has to intervene in the exchange rate market by selling British pounds so that American car buyers can get a hold of those British pounds to go buy those Range Rovers they want to. And then, of course, they buy up dollars in order to appreciate the value. If the U.S. is selling pounds, then they must be, by definition, buying dollars. Or the U.S. could transfer gold to Britain in order to get for dollars. Either way, government to government, you could end up offsetting the fact that the number of consumers in Britain are buying less trips to Disney World than Americans are buying of British-made Range Rovers. Now, of course, this can be done once or twice, but you can't have the government do this continually. There's no way the government can come up with enough British pounds because remember, they're selling British pounds, so that means the US government has to have a reserve of British pounds that they keep around for this purpose. And then once you've sold off all your stock of British pounds, then what do? Then of course you're back at the original problem. We have a shortage of British pounds and a surplus of dollars. So like I said, you can try to rebalance the market through government intervention for a short run period, but you can't do it indefinitely. Now remember, on the adjustments that we need, when you have fixed exchange rates, the currency value itself can't change, so you have to make some kind of other arrangements. And here are some of the domestic adjustments that have to be made. For instance, we could put up protective barriers to eliminate the increased demand for the British goods. So for instance, let's put a tariff on the imported Range Rovers, and that would scare away some Americans from buying the Range Rovers, and therefore the demand for British pounds would go down. That would be one solution. Another one would be to increase taxes. Obviously, with higher taxes, people have less disposable income, and therefore their demand for imports of all kinds would go down, including the demand for the Range Rovers. Or alternatively, the government could raise interest rates. Remember, we talked about interest rates before. If interest rates in the United States are higher than they are in Great Britain, then savers in the world, let's say a Brit who's got wealthy enough to have a choice to either invest in British banks or invest in American banks, if the American banks are paying high interest rates than the British banks, then of course the Brit would take his British pounds, go to the market, buy dollars, sell the British pounds, and come up with dollars to invest in the American banks. That would of course now supply more British pounds to the market to ease this shortage of British pounds. All of these issues would be necessary in some combination to change the total demand for British pounds and the demand for American dollars. Because remember, in this example, there's too much demand for British pounds, but the price of the British pounds doesn't change to bring supply and demand back into balance. So this would be what's necessary in a fixed exchange rate system. Now finally, let's get back to our flexible exchange rates and point out something. We've been comparing and contrasting both flexible rates with the fixed rate system. What are the advantages of the flexible rate? You notice here in the diagram, I'm going to highlight it with my little pointer, this was the problem that the fixed exchange rate caused. The demand, when it's greater than the supply, the exchange rate itself stays fixed at E1 in this example, so at this point the demand is going to be much higher than the supply. And therefore we have a balance of payments problem. And that's what the flexible exchange rate system solves. By permitting the exchange rate to rise, you notice in this diagram it goes from E1 up to E2. At E2 you see that supply and demand are here in balance, aren't they? And that's because at the higher exchange rate, Americans are discouraged from buying those British Range Rovers, and the Brits, who now find their currency appreciating and the American dollar depreciating, find it cheap to go to Disney World, so they supply British pounds to the market at exactly the amount that we need for those remaining people who want to buy a Range Rover to get the British pounds that they need, and the market's brought into balance. So you don't have a balance of payments problem. So this is why most countries in the world, well, all countries in the world, we've now migrated to a flexible exchange rate system. There is no longer a fixed rate exchange rate system. So on that point, we're going to finish up and end chapter 20.